The polished marble floors of Westfield Mall reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as Kyle Thompson strutted through the East Wing, his new Gucci loafers clicking against the surface. The scent of success, his $3,000 leather jacket, and the weight of his father's black card in his wallet had become intoxicating over the past month. "Excuse me, sir," a familiar voice called out. "Wet floor ahead." Kyle froze. That voice. He turned slowly, his designer sunglasses catching the light, to face James Martinez, his former best friend from middle school, now wearing a janitor's uniform, a mop clutched in his calloused hands. James, Kyle's voice dripped with manufactured surprise. "I almost didn't recognize you in that." Uniform, his eyes flickered to the name tag, then to the worn boots James wore. "Still working your way through community college?" James straightened his back, dignity evident in his posture. "Actually, I'm supporting my mom's cancer treatment. Not all of us can afford private health care." The words hit Kyle like a punch to the gut, triggering a flash of memory. His own mother, pale and weak in a county hospital bed, his father counting coins for the vending machine. But he pushed it down, buried it under the weight of his new Rolex. "Well," Kyle adjusted his Italian silk tie, "maybe if your family had made better choices." "Like your dad did," James cut in quietly. "I remember when he used to give my family rides to the food bank in his beat-up Toyota. Back when you were human, Kyle." The gathering crowd of shoppers pretended not to stare, but Kyle felt their eyes. His face burned. 1 month ago he had been just like them, ordinary, struggling, invisible. But now... "You don't know anything about my family," Kyle snapped, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "We worked for everything we have." James shook his head slowly, a mix of pity and disappointment in his eyes. "No, Kyle. Your father worked for everything you have, and I bet he'd be real proud to see how you're using it right now." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but the memory of his father's face at the bank 1 month ago stopped him cold, the pride in his eyes as he explained how 25 years of sacrifice had finally paid off. The sound of James's mop bucket rolling away brought Kyle back to the present. He watched his old friend disappear into the service corridor, leaving behind not just a clean floor, but the ghost of who Kyle used to be before money changed everything. What Kyle didn't know then was that this moment, this seemingly simple encounter in a shopping mall, would set in motion a chain of events that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about wealth, worth, and the true price of pride. 1 month earlier, in a small local bank branch, a casual visit with his father was about to change his life forever. Witness the gripping tale of wealth, redemption, and humanity. Subscribe now to experience life-changing stories that touch your soul deeply. Richard Thompson stood at his kitchen window every morning at 4:30 a.m., just as he had for the past 25 years. The ritual began the day after his wife Sarah's funeral, when he promised himself that their son Kyle would never know the pain of poverty again. Their modest home in the working-class district of Boston held memories in every corner. Sarah's favorite yellow curtains, still hanging despite their fade, her collection of thrift store teacups, each with a chip or crack that told its own story of sacrifice. 25 years ago, Richard was a junior accountant, living paycheck to paycheck with a newborn son and a wife battling an aggressive form of leukemia. The county hospital's fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell became their second home. Each treatment depleted their savings. Each consultation brought more devastating news. Sarah needed specialized care they couldn't afford, treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. Richard took on 3 jobs, accounting by day, delivery driving in the evenings, and weekend bookkeeping for local businesses. He sold their car, pawned Sarah's engagement ring with her blessing, and moved them into a 1-room apartment. But it wasn't enough. The experimental treatment that might have saved her remained perpetually out of reach, locked behind a $250,000 price tag they could never hope to afford. Sarah passed away on a Tuesday morning. while Kyle slept peacefully in his second-hand crib. Her last words to Richard were not of regret or anger at their circumstances, but of hope. "Promise me you'll give Kyle the life we dreamed of. Promise me you'll show him that hard work and kindness matter more than money." But that promise became Richard's driving force. He went back to school at night, earning his CP while working days. He lived on coffee and determination, wearing the same 3 shirts for years, patching Kyle's clothes by hand. Every spare dollar went into investments, careful, calculated risks that slowly began to pay off. He learned to navigate the financial world with the same precision he once applied to stretching their grocery budget. But Richard never forgot the sting of helplessness, the shame of having to choose between electricity and medicine. Even as his investments flourished and his client list grew, he maintained their modest lifestyle. Kyle grew up wearing second-hand clothes and taking public transport, while his college fund quietly swelled into 6 figures. Richard drove the same Toyota for 15 years, while his portfolio diversified into real estate and blue-chip stocks. The local food bank where they once stood in line now received anonymous monthly donations. The hospital wing where Sarah spent her final days benefited from a scholarship fund for families facing catastrophic medical bills. Richard did it all quietly, teaching Kyle the value of hard work and compassion, hoping his son would understand that true wealth wasn't about designer labels or luxury cars. For 25 years, Richard carried the weight of his promise to Sarah, building a fortune in silence while living like a man of modest means. He watched Kyle grow into a hard-working young man who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and tutored struggling classmates for free. Each time Kyle showed kindness, despite their apparent circumstances, Richard felt Sarah's approval. Now, at 62, Richard had finally achieved what seemed impossible, that terrible Tuesday morning financial security that could protect his family from the cruel choices poverty demands. His net worth had crossed 7 figures, a secret he'd planned to share with Kyle when the time was right, when he was sure his son understood that money was a tool for helping others, not a measure of human worth. But as Richard stood at his kitchen window that fateful morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope, he couldn't know that his carefully laid plans were about to unravel. The lesson he'd spent 25 years teaching was about to be tested in ways he never imagined, and the true meaning of Sarah's last words would soon become painfully clear. Kyle Thompson's earliest memory was the sound of coins clinking against glass, his father counting pennies in their cramped kitchen, illuminated by a single bulb with a chain that never quite worked right. At 6 years old, he didn't understand why they couldn't afford new shoes like his classmates, or why his father's eyes would grow distant when he mentioned his mother's photo on the dresser. School became a daily exercise in humiliation. His second-hand backpack, patched 3 times with his father's clumsy stitching, earned him the nickname Goodwill Kyle in 3rd grade. Madison Brooks loudly announced at lunch that her mother said the Thompsons were charity cases, after seeing them at the food bank. Kyle learned to eat alone in the library, burying himself in books about successful businessmen and self-made millionaires. The worst day came in 7th grade when Emma Parker, his first crush, invited him to her birthday party. He spent weeks doing extra chores for neighbors, saving every quarter, only to discover the invitation was a cruel prank. He arrived at the party venue in his carefully ironed shirt from the thrift store, a handmade card clutched in his sweating palm, to find Emma and her friends recording his reaction for social media. "Did you really think you could afford to be here?" her words echoed in his dreams for years. But it wasn't all darkness. Every Sunday, Richard would take Kyle to the park with a worn baseball mitt and endless patience. They couldn't afford Little League fees, but his father never missed a chance to practice catching and pitching. On Kyle's birthday, they had a tradition, splitting a single slice of chocolate cake from the local bakery, pretending it was a whole cake just for them. His father would tell stories about Sarah, about her laugh that could light up a room, about how she could make a cardboard box feel like a castle with just her imagination. James Martinez became Kyle's best friend in middle school, another kid from the wrong side of the tracks who understood what it meant to wear shoes until they fell apart. They spent afternoons dreaming up business ideas, convinced they'd become millionaires and buy their parents' houses with pools. James never made fun of Kyle's free lunch tickets or the holes in his jeans. The library became Kyle's sanctuary. The librarian, Mrs. Wilson, would save magazines about finance and business for him, slipping him extra cookies during study hall. "Your father is the richest man I know," she would say, confusing Kyle until she explained, "He has what money can't buy: integrity and a heart of gold." But despite these pockets of warmth, poverty's shadow was ever present. Kyle watched his father skip meals, claiming he'd eaten at work. He noticed how Richard would mend his own clothes in the dark to save on electricity, how he worked through fevers and exhaustion, how his hands grew calloused from endless hours of typing and manual labor. Each sacrifice was a weight added to Kyle's growing burden of resentment toward their circumstances. The photo of his mother on the dresser became both comfort and curse. Sarah Thompson's frozen smile seemed to mock their struggles, her absence a constant reminder of how poverty had stolen not just their dignity, but their chance at being a complete family. Kyle would sometimes talk to her picture late at night, promising to become rich enough to make sure no one in his family would ever suffer again. As he grew older, Kyle developed a fierce determination masked by quiet humility. He worked harder than anyone in his classes, earned perfect grades, and helped other struggling students not out of pure kindness, but to prove he was better than the whispers and sideways glances his worn clothes attracted. Each act of charity directed at his family fueled a deep-seated desire to rise above it all, to become someone who would never need help from anyone again. What Kyle couldn't know was that his father's silent accumulation of wealth would soon test every lesson, every scar, and every dream born in the crucible of their apparent poverty. The true cost of his childhood was about to be measured not in dollars, but in the currency of character. James Martinez carried his janitor's uniform with quiet dignity, each crease pressed as carefully as any businessman's suit. At 22, he had already lived several lifetimes' worth of hardship. His mother's cancer diagnosis came the same week he received his college acceptance letter. Without hesitation, he deferred his dreams of becoming an engineer, taking the only job that offered health insurance for dependents. His name tag might say maintenance staff, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who could solve complex equations while mopping floors. Emma Parker's designer heels clicked through the mall's corridors like a metronome of privilege. As the daughter of Boston's prominent real estate mogul, she had orchestrated the cruel birthday party prank against Kyle 5 years ago. Now a marketing executive at her father's firm, she carried the weight of that childhood cruelty beneath her polished exterior. Occasionally she would catch glimpses of Kyle in the mall, each citing a reminder of the mean-spirited child she used to be. Her attempts at apologizing were rebuffed by Kyle's new wall of expensive indifference. Mrs. Anderson, known to more regulars as the bench lady, appeared unremarkable at first glance. Her grey hair was always neatly pinned, her clothes clean but dated. Few knew she had once been one of Boston's most successful investment bankers before losing everything in a scandal that destroyed her reputation but not her integrity. Now she spent her days observing humanity from her favorite mall bench, sharing her lunch with stray dogs and dispensing wisdom to those wise enough to listen. The trio of Nelson Parker, Emma's younger brother, Jeremy Watson, and Alex Chen formed Kyle's new social circle, Sons of Privilege, who accepted him based solely on his apparent wealth. Nelson, a tech prodigy with a cruel streak, used his skills to create apps that reinforced social hierarchies. Jeremy, whose family's old money bought him endless second chances, treated life like a game he couldn't lose. Alex, despite his family's pharmaceutical fortune, harbored secret doubts about their lifestyle, making him the most human of the group. Sarah Thompson's presence, though 5 years gone, remained palpable through the small kindnesses Richard performed in her memory. The hospital staff still spoke of the woman who would sing to other patients' children, who organized a Christmas gift drive from her own hospital bed. Her influence lived on in the way Kyle unconsciously straightened pictures in hallways, a habit he'd inherited from her. Dr. Michael Stevens, the oncologist who had treated both Sarah Thompson and Mrs. Martinez, carried the burden of knowing how wealth or its absence could determine survival. His office walls were lined with photos of survivors, with conspicuous gaps where those who couldn't afford treatment should have been. He watched the cycle repeat itself with James's mother, his hands tied by the same system that had failed Sarah. These characters orbited Kyle's transformation like planets around a darkening sun, each playing a crucial role in the story about to unfold. Their interconnected lives would become the mirror in which Kyle would eventually see his true reflection, their struggles and triumphs weaving together to create a tapestry of redemption that none of them could predict. But first, they would all witness the damage that sudden wealth could inflict on a soul shaped by scarcity, and learn that the true measure of a person lies not in their bank balance, but in the choices they make when fortune shifts its fickle favor. The morning that changed everything dawned like any other. Kyle accompanied his father to Boston Community Bank, their monthly ritual since he was old enough to understand the importance of saving. The familiar scent of coffee and paper money filled the air as they waited in line, Kyle absently studying the posters advertising home loans and retirement accounts. "Have a good rest of your day," the teller called to the customer ahead of them. Richard stepped forward, his worn leather wallet in hand. Kyle noticed how his father's fingers trembled slightly as he prepared to make his usual modest deposit, a detail that would later seem prophetic. "I'd like to make a deposit, please," Richard said, sliding a carefully counted stack of bills across the counter. Kyle had seen this scene hundreds of times, his father's methodical counting, the precise way he filled out deposit slips, the quiet dignity with which he handled their seemingly meager finances. "Would you like to know your balance?" the teller asked, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. Richard nodded, a gesture so casual it belied the bombshell about to drop. Kyle's attention had already drifted to his phone, scrolling through social media posts of classmates showing off their latest purchases. "After this deposit, it is $1,629,743, the teller's voice carried the warmth of genuine congratulation. "Congratulations, you've officially crossed 7 figures. Kyle's phone clattered to the counter. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as he processed the numbers. $1,629,743. His father, his coupon clipping, thrift store shopping. Never buy knew anything father was a millionaire. Dad, the word came out as a strangled whisper. "Oh my God, you never told me we were millionaires." The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, the air too thin. Memories cascaded through his mind, shared slices of birthday cake, patched clothing, free school lunches, Emma's birthday party humiliation, all while this fortune sat in the bank. Richard's face held a complex mixture of pride and apprehension. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess after 25 years of hard work, it's finally paid off." His attempt at a casual tone fell flat against the magnitude of the revelation. Other customers pretended not to listen, but their sideways glances and poorly concealed interest were palpable. The teller's professional smile remained fixed, but her eyes darted between father and son, sensing the seismic shift occurring before her. 25 years, Kyle's voice rose slightly. "How long have you been? How much did we have when Mom?" He couldn't finish the question, but its weight hung in the air between them. Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let's discuss this at home, son," Richard said softly, tucking his receipt into his wallet with the same careful movement he'd used when they could barely afford groceries. But Kyle barely heard him, his mind racing through calculations. How many treatments could this money have bought? How many nights of worry could it have prevented? As they walked toward the exit, Kyle felt the eyes of every person in the bank following them. He straightened his shoulders unconsciously, suddenly aware of his scuffed shoes and last season's clearance rack jacket. Each step seemed to carry him further from the person he'd been when he walked in the humble, hard-working son of a struggling single father. In the parking lot, Richard headed toward their old Toyota, its faded paint and slight rust spots, now seeming like an elaborate costume rather than necessity. Kyle stopped short, reality crashing over him in waves. "We need to celebrate," he announced, his voice carrying a new edge. No more pretending to be poor. No more second-hand. Anything his father's attempts to interject went unheard as Kyle continued. "We're going shopping." "Right now." Richard's keys jangled in his hesitating hand. "Kyle, money doesn't change who we are." "But it changes everything else," Kyle cut him off, already pulling out his phone to search for the nearest luxury car dealership. "And it's about time we started living like who we really are." As they pulled out of the parking lot, neither father nor son noticed Mrs. Anderson sitting on her usual bench outside the bank, watching them with knowing eyes. She had seen this scene before, the intoxicating moment when someone discovers they're rich, the precise instant when money begins its insidious work of revealing or corrupting character. The old Toyota turned the corner, carrying its passengers toward a future that would test every lesson, every value, and every bond between them. The numbers in the bank account had finally been revealed, but the true cost of this revelation was still to be calculated. The Italian leather of the Porsche's steering wheel felt alien under Kyle's grip as he guided the car out of the dealership lot. His father sat silently in the passenger seat, the paperwork for their $175,000 purchase folded neatly in his weathered wallet, a jarring contrast to the vehicle's gleaming dashboard. This was just the beginning of Kyle's transformation, a metamorphosis that would unfold over the next few weeks like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis made of gold. "When you said celebrate, I thought you meant dinner," Richard murmured, his fingers tracing the pristine leather interior. Kyle barely heard him, intoxicated by the purr of the engine and the admiring glances from pedestrians. Their first stop was Westfield Mall, not the clearance racks this time, but the high-end boutiques he'd only window shopped before. The transformation was swift and dramatic. Gone were the carefully mended clothes and practical shoes, replaced by an arsenal of designer labels. Gucci, Prada, Versace. Kyle consumed them all with a hunger born of years of deprivation. Each swipe of his newly acquired black card felt like revenge against every sideways glance and whispered comment he'd endured. Word spread through Boston's elite private school circuit like wildfire. The previously invisible Kyle Thompson was suddenly the subject of intense interest. Nelson Parker, who had once joined in mocking Kyle's free lunch status, was the first to extend an invitation to his exclusive weekend gathering. "You've been holding out on us," Thompson, Nelson declared at his mansion's pool party, clapping Kyle on the shoulder. "We always knew you had potential." The words were honey-coated poison, but Kyle drank them eagerly. Jeremy Watson and Alex Chen, scions of old money families, quickly formed a triumvirate of wealth around him. Emma Parker, watching from her poolside perch, observed the transformation with a mixture of fascination and unease. The shy, kind boy who had once brought her a handmade birthday card was disappearing behind a facade of expensive sunglasses and practiced indifference. When their eyes met across the pool, Kyle's deliberately cold nod made her flinch, a small victory that tasted like ash in his mouth. At home, the changes were equally dramatic. Kyle hired interior decorators to transform their modest house, despite his father's protests. Out went Sarah's worn yellow curtains and cherished teacup collection, replaced by minimalist art and designer furniture. Each discarded item felt like shedding a layer of their old life, though Richard quietly rescued the teacups from the donation box, hiding them in his closet. The local diner where they'd shared countless father-son breakfasts was abandoned in favor of trendy brunch spots, where single eggs cost more than their old weekly grocery budget. Kyle learned to pronounce French wines and Italian dishes, adopted the casual arrogance of old money, and practiced looking down his nose at service workers, a skill that made his father's face tight with disapproval. social media became Kyle's stage for displaying his newfound wealth. Carefully curated photos of luxury cars, designer clothes, and exclusive venues filled his feed. His follower count exploded, each like and comment feeding the growing void inside him. Former classmates who had once ignored him now slid into his DMs, their sudden interest as transparent as it was intoxicating. The final piece of his transformation came in the form of an exclusive credit card, black and heavy in his wallet. "Just for emergencies," Richard had said, his voice heavy with reluctance. Kyle nodded seriously, already planning his next shopping spree. The $10,000 limit his father set seemed like a formality after all. They were millionaires now. But beneath the designer labels and practiced smirk, something was shifting in Kyle's soul. Each morning he spent longer in front of the mirror, not just checking his appearance, but searching for traces of his old self in his reflection. The kind boy who had helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and tutored struggling classmates was becoming a stranger, replaced by someone who measured worth in thread counts and horsepower. Richard watched this metamorphosis with growing concern. His attempts at conversation met with increasingly dismissive responses. "Money doesn't change who we are," he would begin, only to have Kyle cut him off with, "No, it just lets us be who we were always meant to be." The final thread of their old life snapped one Sunday morning when Kyle refused their traditional park baseball game, citing brunch plans with his new friends. As he roared away in the Porsche, Richard stood in the driveway holding the worn baseball mitt, looking less like a millionaire and more like a man watching his greatest fear unfold. What neither of them realized was that this transformation was just the beginning. The true test of character was still to come, and the price of pride would be calculated in a currency far more precious than dollars. As Kyle's old Toyota gathered dust in the garage, covered by a designer car cover that cost more than its blue book value, the stage was set for a lesson that no amount of money could buy. The first real confrontation erupted in the school cafeteria on a Tuesday morning. Kyle sat at his new table, the unofficial throne of privilege where Nelson Parker and his crew held court. His Gucci loafers propped on a spare chair, he barely glanced up when James Martinez approached, still wearing the same worn backpack they'd once joked about sharing in harder times. "Kyle, can we talk?" James's voice was low, meant only for his former friend's ears, but Kyle's new social circle leaned in, sensing entertainment. "About the tutoring program you missed 3 sessions last week. Those kids really need." "Oh, right," the charity case crew Kyle interrupted, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet cafeteria. "Sorry, but I've got better things to do now than help losers pass basic math." The words felt foreign in his mouth, but the appreciative snickers from his new friends drowned out his conscience. James stood very still, his hands gripping his lunch tray. "What happened to you, man? Your dad taught us both that success means nothing if you forget where you came from." The mention of his father sparked something ugly in Kyle's chest. Well, maybe Dad was wrong about a lot of things. Like pretending to be poor when we had millions in the bank. He stood up, using his new designer height to look down at his old friend. "Speaking of which, how's your mum's treatment going?" "Still can't afford the good doctors." The cafeteria went deadly quiet. James's face drained of color, but before he could respond, Emma Parker stepped between them. "That's enough, Kyle," she said quietly. "You've made your point." Kyle turned his sneer on her. "Oh, look who found her conscience. Feeling guilty about something, Emma. Maybe a certain birthday party, the flush that crept up her neck was another small victory that somehow felt like defeat." Later that afternoon, Richard received the first of what would become many concerned phone calls. Kyle's economics teacher reported that his star student had begun mocking classmates who couldn't afford the latest textbooks. The guidance counselor mentioned his withdrawal from all volunteer activities. The tutoring program coordinator described crying middle schoolers who didn't understand why their mentor had abandoned them. The confrontation at home was worse for its quietness. Richard sat at their new designer dining table, Kyle's old baseball mitt placed between them like evidence at a trial. "I got some calls today," Richard began, his voice heavy with disappointment. "About the tutoring program, about James, about the way you're treating people." Kyle examined his manicured nails. "And? We're not charity cases anymore, Dad. We don't have to pretend to care about those people." "Those people," Richard's voice cracked slightly. "Those people are who we are, Kyle. That money in the bank doesn't change where we came from or what we owe to others." "What we owe," Kyle's laugh was bitter. "Like what you owed Mom. All that money sitting there while He stopped abruptly, but the damage was done. Richard's face went ashen. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken accusations. Finally, Richard stood up, leaving the baseball mitt on the table. "Your mother would be so disappointed in who you're becoming," he said softly, each word precise as a surgeon's cut. Kyle watched his father walk away, fighting the urge to call him back, to apologize, to ask about the money and his mother and everything else that churned in his gut. Instead, he pulled out his phone and ordered another designer jacket he didn't need. The next morning, he arrived at school to find someone had keyed his Porsche, scratching a single word into the pristine paint: "fake." The rage that filled him was real enough, but as he stood there, surrounded by sympathetic new friends and hostile old ones, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that the vandal had seen something true about him that he was trying desperately to ignore. That evening, as Kyle sat in his redesigned bedroom, scrolling through social media likes from people who'd never spoken to him before last month, his father's words echoed in his head, "Your mother would be so disappointed." He glanced at the empty spot where her photo used to sit, before he'd replaced it with abstract art, and felt something crack inside his carefully constructed new identity. But it was too late to turn back now. The transformation was complete, the bridges were burning, and Kyle Thompson, newly minted member of the wealthy elite, was about to learn that the true cost of forgetting where you come from can't be measured in dollars and cents. The library's quiet study area had become the unlikely headquarters for what Nelson Parker called Operation Net Worth, surrounded by leather-bound books neither of them would ever read. Nelson hunched over his laptop while Kyle paced behind him, designer shoes clicking against marble floors. "Imagine being able to see everyone's bank accounts," Nelson mused, fingers flying across the keyboard. "Like financial X-ray vision. No more fake rich people pretending they belong in our world." The irony of his words was lost on Kyle, who leaned in closer, watching lines of code scroll past. Nelson had discovered a vulnerability in several banking apps' APIs, a digital backdoor that allowed him to create what he called a wealth detector. Kyle didn't understand the technical details, but he understood power. And this was power in its purest form. "Think about it," Nelson continued, his voice thick with malicious excitement. "We could expose every wannabe at school. All those kids with fake designer bags and knockoff watches, they won't be able to hide anymore." He glanced up at Kyle. "No offense about your past, bro. You're one of us now." The words stung more than they should have. Kyle pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the possibilities Nelson was describing. "How accurate is it?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Accurate enough to ruin lives," Nelson laughed. The sound echoed off the library walls, drawing a sharp look from the librarian, the same Mrs. Wilson who had once saved business magazines for Kyle. He avoided her gaze, but testing began the next day. Kyle and Nelson set up court in the school courtyard, their target audience gathering around them like moths to a flame. The first victim was a sophomore girl who'd been bragging about her new Chanel bag. "Oh, Jessica," Nelson called out, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Interesting that your family's net worth is only $23,456. That bag must have cost, what, 3 months of your dad's salary?" The girl's face crumpled as laughter erupted around her. Kyle felt a twist in his stomach but pressed on. "Who's next?" The crowd's eager response drowned out his conscience. One by one, they exposed their classmates' financial situations: the boy whose family was facing foreclosure, the girl whose single mother worked 3 jobs, the athlete whose scholarship was the only thing keeping him in school. Power, Kyle discovered, was addictive. Each revelation, each public humiliation, felt like revenge for every time he'd been mocked for his own poverty. But something changed when James Martinez walked past. "Hey, James," Nelson called out. "Want to know what your family's worth?" The maintenance uniform James wore after school made him an easy target. But before Nelson could announce the number, James turned to face them. "I already know what my family's worth," he said quietly. "And it has nothing to do with money." His eyes met Kyle's. "Some people understand that. Or at least they used to." The moment hung in the air like a challenge. Kyle felt the weight of his new friend's expectations, the pressure to maintain his carefully constructed facade. "Well, let's see what the numbers say," he heard himself say. "Nelson." The figure appeared on the screen, $7,291. The crowd snickered, but James didn't flinch. "That's my mom's medical bills," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "The ones your dad used to help us with, Kyle, remember?" The memory hit Kyle like a physical blow, his father writing checks to the hospital, claiming they were just getting by themselves. How many other families had he helped while maintaining their facade of poverty? But it was too late to stop. The app had become their scepter, and Kyle and Nelson wielded it with increasing cruelty. They exposed the cafeteria workers' minimum wage salary, the janitor's mounting debts, the security guard's second mortgage. Each revelation felt more hollow than the last, but Kyle couldn't stop, not with Nelson watching, not with his new status to maintain. That evening, as Kyle sat in his room surrounded by designer labels and empty shopping bags, he caught his reflection in his new floor-length mirror. For a moment he didn't recognize himself. The boy who had once shared his lunch with classmates who couldn't afford food was gone, replaced by someone who used their financial struggles for entertainment. His phone buzzed with a text from Nelson. "Tomorrow we go public." "Whole school needs to see this." Kyle stared at the message, feeling the last threads of his old self slipping away. He texted back a thumbs-up emoji, then sat in the dark, wondering why victory felt so much like loss. In the kitchen downstairs, Richard Thompson sat at the table, holding one of Sarah's old teacups, listening to the silence where his son's laughter used to be. The credit card statement lay between them on the kitchen table like a loaded gun. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he turned each page, the total climbing higher with every designer label, every luxury purchase, every desperate attempt by Kyle to prove his worth through spending. $110,000, Richard finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You spent $110,000 in 3 weeks. Kyle, the number hung in the air between them, a monument to excess that made their old struggles seem almost quaint. The limit was $10,000. Kyle lounged against the designer kitchen counter, affecting an air of indifference that cost as much as his new watch. "We're millionaires, Dad. What's the big deal? It's probably what we make in interest anyway." That money, Richard's voice cracked slightly, was meant for emergencies, for helping others. For your future. He looked up at his son, searching for any trace of the boy who once counted pennies to buy his father a birthday card. "Do you know how many families like James's we could help with what you spent on clothes you'll never wear twice?" The mention of James sparked Kyle's defensive anger. "Don't start with James again. His family's financial problems aren't our responsibility. We worked for our money." "No," Richard cut him off, standing so abruptly his chair scraped against the Italian marble floor. "I worked for this money. Every hour of overtime, every missed baseball game, every night I lay awake wondering if I was doing right by you and your mother." He stopped, emotion choking his words. Kyle rolled his eyes, a gesture that cost him more than money. "Right by Mom? You mean when you had millions in the bank, but wouldn't spend it on her treatment?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went ash-gray, and for a moment Kyle thought his father might collapse. When Richard spoke again, his voice was different, older, heavier. "You want to know about the money, Kyle? When your mother got sick, we had nothing. I worked 3 jobs, sold everything we had, borrowed from everyone who would lend to us. The experimental treatment she needed cost $250,000. By the time I had saved enough." He closed his eyes, reliving the moment. It was too late. Kyle felt the floor shift beneath his designer shoes. But the millions came later. Every penny earned after I promised your mother I'd make sure you never knew the pain of poverty. Richard's laugh was hollow. "Looks like I failed at that too. You know poverty intimately now, the poverty of character that comes from having too much too soon." The words hit Kyle like physical blows, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "At least I'm not pretending to be something I'm not anymore. Living like we're poor when we're rich. That's the real lie." Richard gathered the credit card statements with trembling hands. "You have 1 week," he said quietly. 1 week to pay back everything over the original $10,000 limit. After that, I'm returning it all." "You can't do that," Kyle's carefully constructed facade cracked. "Those clothes are mine. The car. The car that you let your friends vandalize James's mother's car with." Richard's voice was ice. "Yes, I know about that too. 1 week, Kyle. Consider it a lesson in consequences, something I should have taught you better before." Kyle pushed off from the counter, his anger masking his fear. "Fine, I'll get the money. I don't need your help anymore anyway." As he stormed toward the door, Richard called after him softly. "Your mother used to say that wealth was like water. It could either nourish or drown you. Right now, son, you're drowning." Kyle slammed the door, the sound echoing through their expensively remodeled house. He got into his Porsche, hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The leather seat that had once felt like a throne now felt like a prison of his own making. Looking up at his bedroom window, he caught a glimpse of his father standing there, still holding the credit card statements. For a moment, Kyle saw him as he used to, not as the man who had hidden their wealth, but as the father who had worked himself to exhaustion, trying to provide a better life for his son. But pride and fear are powerful adversaries to understanding. Kyle revved the engine, drowning out the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his old self, the self that would have been horrified by who he had become. As he peeled out of the driveway, he didn't see Richard sink into a kitchen chair, pulling out Sarah's old photo from his wallet. "Help me reach him," he whispered to his wife's smiling image, "before he loses everything that really matters." Neither father nor son slept that night, one worried about the soul he was losing, the other about the son who was already lost. The week's deadline loomed ahead, but the real countdown wasn't about money at all. It was about how long it would take for Kyle to realize that his father's millions weren't the real inheritance he stood to lose. The confrontation at Westfield Mall unfolded like a scene from a Greek tragedy, with James Martinez's janitor cart playing the role of fate's instrument. The polished floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as Kyle strutted through the East Wing with Nelson and their crew, their laughter echoing off designer storefronts. "Watch it," Kyle snapped as James's mop bucket rolled too close to his $1,200 shoes. The silence that followed was thick with recognition, former best friends now separated by an ocean of wealth and choices. "My apologies," Sir James replied, emphasis heavy on the last word. Wouldn't want to damage anything expensive. His eyes met Kyle's, holding memories of shared lunches and borrowed textbooks. Nelson stepped forward, phone in hand. "Hey, Martinez, want to know your current net worth?" "Oh wait, we already exposed that yesterday." The small crowd of shoppers pretended not to watch, but their attention was palpable. "You know what's funny?" James straightened his uniform vest. "I remember when Kyle and I used to clean these same floors as summer volunteers. Said it taught us humility. Remember that, Kyle?" The memory stung two 14-year-old boys with mops too big for them, laughing as they raced to finish their sections. Kyle pushed it aside. "Well, some of us evolved past janitorial work. Sorry you got stuck in the family business of being poor." The words hung in the air like poison. James's face hardened, but before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Kyle Thompson Richards' voice carried across the mall corridor. He stood there, still in his work clothes, holding a small package wrapped in familiar yellow paper, Sarah's favorite color. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Kyle's voice cracked slightly, his carefully constructed facade wavering. "Buying your mother's favorite tea for her memorial tomorrow. The anniversary you seem to have forgotten." Richard's eyes took in the scene, his son surrounded by sneering friends, James with his mop, the gathered crowd. What would she think of this, Kyle? The mention of his mother hit Kyle like a physical blow. Tomorrow's date flashed in his mind. How had he forgotten? He'd never missed visiting her grave, not once in 5 years. "Oh, touching family moment," Nelson snickered, reaching for his phone. "Let's check Daddy's real net worth while we're at it." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. James stepped forward, deliberately knocking the phone from Nelson's hand. It skittered across the wet floor, disappearing under a bench. Nelson lunged, but James stood his ground. "That's enough," James said quietly. "Kyle, your mom used to bring us hot chocolate when we volunteered here. She said serving others was the highest form of wealth." His voice carried across the now silent corridor. "But I guess that kind of wealth doesn't show up on your app, does it?" Kyle felt the world tilt. The memory hit him full force, his mother's thermos of hot chocolate, her proud smile as she watched them work, the way she'd tell stories about her own first job mopping floors. The same floors he now considered beneath him. Kyle, his father's voice was gentle but firm. "It's time to come home. Really come home." For a moment, Kyle stood frozen between worlds, the fake glamour of his new life and the authentic warmth of his old one. He saw himself reflected in the mall's windows, a stranger in expensive clothes, surrounded by people who would drop him the instant his money disappeared. The package in his father's hands caught the light, its yellow paper the exact shade of the curtains he'd thrown away, their old curtains, Mom's curtains. Something broke inside Kyle, not the shattering of pride, but the cracking of a shell that had hardened around his heart. Without a word, he stepped away from Nelson and the others, toward his father and the memory of who he used to be. "Hey," Nelson called after him. "What about our plans? The app? Everything we built?" Kyle turned back, seeing his former friends clearly for the first time. "You didn't build anything," he said quietly. "You just destroyed things, starting with me." As he walked away with his father, past James, who gave him a slight nod of acknowledgement, Kyle felt lighter than he had in weeks. The weight of his designer clothes seemed to lessen with each step. Behind them, the sound of James's mop hitting the floor echoed like a judge's gavel, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The mall's security cameras recorded it all, the moment a lost son found his way back to himself, guided by the memory of yellow curtains and hot chocolate on cold winter mornings. The aftermath of the mall incident spread through Boston's elite social circles like wildfire. Kyle's Instagram followers dropped by the thousands overnight, his phone buzzing with gleeful notifications of each departure. The designer clothes in his closet seemed to mock him, each price tag a reminder of the person he'd tried to become. Nelson Parker's revenge was swift and calculated. By Monday morning, screenshots of Kyle's family's past financial struggles circulated through private group chats. Old photos emerged: Kyle in threadbare clothes at school events, the Thompsons' ancient Toyota parked at the food bank, Richard working his second job at the convenience store. Each image was accompanied by sneering captions about poverty cosplay and Millionaire mind games. Emma Parker, surprisingly, attempted to defend him during lunch. "He was just lost for a while," she said to her brother. "Like I was when I threw that birthday party." Nelson's response was brutal. "Difference is, sis, you were born rich. He just played dress up." The whispers followed Kyle through the school corridors. Fake rich trailer park millionaire charity case with a credit card, each barb carried the sting of truth twisted into poison. The same students who had eagerly sought his friendship now turned their backs, their rejection as coordinated as a choreographed dance. In class, Kyle found himself isolated. The empty seats around him formed a perfect circle of exclusion. His raised hand in economics class, once eagerly acknowledged, now met with the teacher's hesitant pause. Even his perfect test scores became subjects of suspicion. Whispers of bought his way and followed his every achievement. The Porsche sat untouched in the school parking lot, its pristine surface now marred by a new layer of keyed insults. Poser stretched across the hood in deep scratches. Kyle took to parking 3 blocks away and walking, his designer shoes collecting scuffs that he no longer bothered to clean. At home, the silence was deafening. The expensive furniture seemed to absorb sound, creating a mausoleum-like atmosphere that emphasized the distance between father and son. Richard's attempts at conversation were met with monosyllabic responses as Kyle grappled with the magnitude of his transformation and its consequences. One evening, while picking at his dinner, Kyle discovered his credit cards had been deactivated. The notification came through his phone account closed by primary cardholder. His father said nothing, continuing to eat as if the ping of Kyle's phone hadn't shattered the silence. "How am I supposed to pay it back now?" Kyle finally asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Richard looked up, his eyes tired but kind. "The same way I earned it, 1 hour at a time." The next morning, Kyle found a help-wanted sign in their local diner's window, the same diner he'd refused to enter once he discovered their wealth. The owner, Mrs. Chen, had known the Thompsons for years. Her expression when Kyle asked for an application was a complex mixture of surprise and satisfaction. "Dish duty," she said firmly. $6 an hour. No special treatment. The plastic bin of dirty dishes she pointed to might as well have been filled with his own pride. The first shift was brutal. Designer clothes replaced by a stained apron, manicured hands plunged into greasy water, the constant clash and clatter of plates a percussion track to his humiliation. Every muscle screamed by closing time, his soft palms blistered and raw. But it was the familiar faces that hurt most. James's mother, still fighting cancer, stopping in for her usual coffee. The tutoring program kids peering through the window, pointing and whispering. Emma Parker, of all people, sitting at the counter with an untouched plate, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your mum used to work here," Mrs. Chen told him during his break, sliding him a plate of the same chocolate cake he'd once shared with his father. "Put herself through nursing school. Said it taught her more about healing than any textbook." The cake tasted like memory and regret. Kyle thought about his mother, about her dream of becoming a nurse, cut short by illness and economics. He thought about the millions in the bank that came too late to save her, and about his father's decades-long mission to protect him from similar pain. After his shift, Kyle counted his earnings $42.16. A fraction of what he used to spend on a single shirt. At this rate, paying back the credit card debt would take years. The magnitude of his task settled over him like a heavy blanket. Walking home in his food-stained clothes, Kyle passed the mall where everything had fallen apart. Through the window, he saw James mopping the same spot where their confrontation had occurred. Their eyes met briefly and James gave him a small nod, not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition. Recognition of the hard path back to humanity. At home, Kyle found his father in the garage, standing before a stack of cardboard boxes. Inside were Sarah's yellow curtains, her teacup collection, all the pieces of their past he'd so eagerly discarded. "I thought," Richard said quietly, "it might be time to bring some things back home." Kyle picked up a teacup, its chip familiar under his fingers. The price tag from the thrift store was still attached 50 cents. Less than a minute's worth of depreciation on his now unused Porsche. The understanding hit him with the force of revelation. His father hadn't hidden their wealth to punish him. He'd hidden it to protect something far more valuable, the ability to see worth in things that money couldn't buy. Kyle's phone buzzed one last time, a final follower leaving his social media orbit. He deleted the apps without looking at the notifications. Some departures, he was learning, made room for returns that mattered more. The old woman on the mall bench had become as much a fixture as the fountain she sat beside, her grey hair always neatly pinned, her clothes clean but dated. Kyle had passed her 100 times in his designer phase, never sparing her a second glance. Now, trudging to another dishwashing shift in his stained uniform, she caught his eye. She was feeding a mangy stray dog, sharing what looked like her own lunch. The sight irritated Kyle, another reminder of the pointless charity his father had championed, but as he walked past, she spoke. "The thing about falling from grace," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of old Boston money, "is that you finally get to see who's waiting at the bottom to catch you." Kyle stopped, thrown off by her direct address. "Excuse me." "Sit," she patted the bench beside her. "Your shift doesn't start for 20 minutes. I've been watching you walk past every day this week, getting closer to understanding." Something in her tone, not pity, but recognition, made Kyle sink onto the bench. The dog looked up at him with soulful eyes, then returned to its meal. "I used to be Catherine Anderson of the Brighton Andersons," she said, continuing to break her sandwich into small pieces. "Third largest investment firm on the East Coast. Had a corner office on the 40th floor, summer house in the Hamptons, winter chalet in Aspen." Kyle studied her worn shoes, the carefully mended seam of her jacket. "What happened?" "I chose integrity over profit, reported some irregularities in our biggest accounts. The firm collapsed, thousands lost their jobs, my family disowned me." She smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Best thing that ever happened to me." "How is losing everything the best thing?" Kyle's voice cracked with disbelief. "Because I discovered what everything really meant." She reached into her well-worn purse, pulling out a creased photograph. "See this? My former board of directors. 18 people who would have killed to be my friend when I was CEO. Know how many visited when I was in the hospital last year?" Kyle shook his head. "None. But you know who did visit? The janitor from my old building. Brought me soup every day for a week. The same man I used to walk past without seeing, just like he used to walk past me." The parallel hit home. Kyle thought of James, of all the times his former friend had helped others despite having so little himself. "Your father understands this," Mrs. Anderson continued, surprising Kyle. "Oh yes. I know Richard Thompson. He was a junior accountant at my firm before the collapse. One of the few who offered to help me afterward, despite barely making ends meet himself." Kyle's world tilted slightly. "You knew my father when we were poor." "Poor," she laughed, a rich sound that belied her humble appearance. "Your father was the richest man I knew. Not in money back then, he had none, but in character. He taught me how to be wealthy in ways that matter." The dog finished its meal and laid its head on Mrs. Anderson's lap. She stroked it gently. "You see this dog? Everyone walks past, seeing only what it lacks: a home, a pedigree, proper grooming. But it gives love freely, asks nothing in return. That's true wealth." "But you can't pay bills with love," Kyle argued, thinking of his credit card debt. "No," she agreed. "But you can build something more valuable than money: trust, respect, character. Your father spent 25 years building both kinds of wealth. You spent the last month spending one to destroy the other." The truth of her words stung. Kyle remembered how it felt to help others, to be valued for his character rather than his clothes. "How do you get it back?" he asked quietly. "Once you've lost people's respect." Mrs. Anderson stood, gathering her things. "The same way you earn anything worthwhile, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time." She pressed something into his hand. "Start with this." It was half of her remaining sandwich. "But this is your dinner," Kyle protested. "And now it's your chance to make a choice." She nodded toward the dog, who was watching them hopefully. Sometimes the smallest decisions reveal the biggest truths about who we are. As she walked away, Kyle looked at the sandwich in his hand, then at the dog. His designer watch showed 15 minutes until his shift. Slowly, deliberately, he unwrapped the sandwich and broke it into small pieces, just as he'd watched Mrs. Anderson do. The dog's grateful eyes as it ate held no judgment about his clothes, no memory of his arrogance, no concern for his bank balance. In that moment, Kyle understood something his father had tried to teach him for years. True wealth isn't what you have, but what you give when you think nobody's watching. From her new bench across the mall, Mrs. Anderson watched with satisfaction as Kyle shared his first meal with a creature that could offer nothing in return except gratitude. Some lessons, she knew, couldn't be taught with words alone. Kyle was almost late for his shift that day, but Mrs. Chen said nothing about his tardiness. She had seen him through the diner window, finally beginning to understand the difference between being rich and being wealthy. The evening shift at the diner had ended, and Kyle's feet ached as he walked through the darkening streets of Boston. His uniform shirt stuck to his back with dried sweat, and the day's earnings, $48.33 after taxes, felt pitiful in his pocket. That's when he first noticed the man huddled in the alley beside the diner's dumpster. The man's clothes were worn but clean, his grey beard neatly trimmed despite his circumstances. Something about his posture dignified even in despair made Kyle pause. In his former life, just a few weeks ago, he would have walked past without a second glance, maybe even made a cruel comment to impress his wealthy friends. "Excuse me," the man called out softly. "Could you help me find my way home? I seem to be lost." His voice carried an educated accent incongruous with his appearance. Kyle's first instinct was to keep walking, but Mrs. Anderson's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the smallest decisions reveal the biggest truths about who we are. He turned back. "Where do you live?" Kyle asked, keeping a cautious distance. "Bel Air Estates," the man replied. Kyle almost laughed. Bel Air Estates was Boston's most exclusive gated community. Even his new wealth wouldn't have gained him entry there. "Right," Kyle said, sarcasm creeping into his voice. "And I'm Batman." The man's eyes clouded with confusion. "No, you don't understand. I live at 1542 Hillcrest Drive. I have medication. When I don't take it, I get confused. I've been walking for hours." His hands trembled as he spoke. Something in the man's voice, a mixture of dignity and desperation, struck a chord in Kyle. He remembered his mother's voice. Everyone deserves kindness, especially when they can't ask for it properly. Kyle pulled out his phone, hesitating only briefly before opening the ride-sharing app his father still paid for. "Look, I'll get you a ride, but if you're not really from Bel Air..." "Thank you," the man interrupted, his relief palpable. "I'm Thomas. Thomas Whitman." As they waited for the car, Thomas told fragments of his story. He was a retired neurosurgeon who suffered from early-onset dementia. Sometimes, when his medication schedule was disrupted, he would become disoriented and wander. "My son must be worried sick," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "He's all I have left since Helen, my wife, passed away." The parallels to his own family's story made Kyle's chest tight. He thought of his father, wondering if he was worried too, sitting up late in their too-quiet house. When the ride arrived, Kyle did something that surprised himself. He got in with Thomas. "I'll make sure you get home safely," he said, ignoring the driver's suspicious glance in the rearview mirror. During the 20-minute drive, Thomas's lucidity came and went. In his clear moments, he spoke about his medical career, his late wife's charitable work, his son's dedication to caring for him. In his confused periods, he clutched Kyle's hand like a lifeline. At the gates of Bel Air Estates, Kyle expected to be turned away. Instead, the security guard's eyes widened in recognition. "Dr. Whitman, thank God. Your son has half the city looking for you." As they pulled up to an impressive mansion, a man rushed out the front door. Matthew Whitman, Thomas's son, was known in Boston as a philanthropist who funded medical research for neurodegenerative diseases. Dad, Matthew's voice cracked as he embraced his father. Then he turned to Kyle, taking in his disheveled appearance and diner uniform. "You found him? You brought him home?" Kyle shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. He just needed help finding his way. Matthew pulled out his wallet, but Kyle held up his hand. "No, please. I didn't help for money." Thomas, now safely in his son's arms, looked at Kyle with sudden clarity. "You remind me of someone. A patient's son, years ago. A little boy who would read to his mother during her treatments." "Thompson?" "Yes, Sarah Thompson's son." Kyle's world stopped spinning for a moment. You knew my mother." "I was her doctor before her illness progressed beyond my expertise. She was one of my last patients before my own diagnosis." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "She was so proud of you and your father. Always talked about how you two would share a single slice of birthday cake, pretending it was a whole one." The memory hit Kyle like a physical blow, the careful way his father would cut that one slice into two, making each bite a celebration. All those years of stretching dollars, of making less seem like enough, of finding wealth in moments rather than money. Matthew Whitman studied Kyle more carefully. "Thompson. Richard Thompson's son? The investment advisor?" Kyle nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. "Your father does our family's estate planning," Matthew said softly. "He's mentioned you often, always with such pride." Pride, not in Kyle's recent displays of wealth, but in who he had been before, the boy who would read to his dying mother, who would share half a slice of cake and feel rich in love if not in money. As Kyle rode home in another hired car, courtesy of the Whitmans, despite his protests, he held a business card Matthew had pressed into his hand. "Call me tomorrow," Matthew had said. "I think we might have an opportunity to discuss." But it wasn't the potential job offer that occupied Kyle's thoughts. It was his father's voice from weeks ago. "Money doesn't change who we are, it reveals it." Tonight, with no money to his name, except the day's dishwashing wages, Kyle had finally begun to understand what real wealth looked like. It looked like Thomas Whitman's dignity in confusion, like Matthew's devotion to his father, like the memory of sharing birthday cake in a too small apartment filled with too much love to measure. The Whitman Foundation's office lobby was a far cry from the diner's kitchen where Kyle had spent the last 2 weeks washing dishes. His freshly ironed shirt, one of the few items his father had let him keep, felt stiff against his skin as he waited for his appointment with Matthew Whitman. The receptionist's polite smile held no recognition of his former status as one of Boston's elite. Just last month, he would have swaggered in here, flashing designer labels and dropping names. Now, he sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, watching early morning sunlight filter through floor-to-ceiling windows. Kyle Matthews' voice was warm as he emerged from the elevator. "Thank you for coming. Follow me." The executive suite offered a panoramic view of Boston Harbor, but it was the wall of photographs that caught Kyle's eye. Countless faces smiled back, patients, doctors, families. In the center, a familiar face stopped his heart, his mother, Sarah Thompson, seated in a hospital garden, laughing at something off camera. "Your mother was one of our first success stories," Matthew said quietly, following Kyle's gaze. "Not in the way we hoped, but in the way she taught us about dignity in illness." Kyle stepped closer to the photo. She looked so young, so vibrant, despite the hospital gown and IV stand. Success stories. Matthew gestured for Kyle to sit. The Whitman Foundation started as a small fund to help families affected by catastrophic illnesses. Your mother, she helped us understand what families really needed. Not just money for treatment, but support for the whole family. She used to organize game nights in the pediatric ward, even when she could barely stand. The revelation hit Kyle like a physical blow. "I remember those nights. Dad would bring old board games and Mom would make up silly rules to make the sick kids laugh. Exactly, Matthew pulled out a thick folder. But what you probably don't know is that your father has been our biggest anonymous donor for the past 5 years. Kyle's world tilted on its axis. What? Every month, like clockwork. Enough to fund 3 families' complete medical care. He never wanted recognition, never asked for tax receipts. Just said it was Sarah's legacy. The folder contained photographs, thank you letters, and financial statements. Kyle saw his father's signature again and again, attached to donations that must have significantly impacted their net worth. But all those years we lived so carefully, counted every penny. Because your father understood something profound about wealth, Matthew leaned forward. It's not about what you can buy, it's about what you can give away without anyone knowing. A new photo caught Kyle's eye, James Martinez's mother, receiving chemotherapy in a private room. The date stamp was from last week. Yes, Matthew nodded, seeing his recognition. Your father has been covering her treatments anonymously since day one. He said something about repaying an old friendship. Kyle remembered James's words in the mall. Your dad used to help us with the medical bills. The truth of it, the sheer scope of his father's quiet generosity, made his own recent behavior seem even more shameful. Why are you showing me all this? Kyle asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because Matthew stood and walked to the window. We need someone to run our young philanthropist program. Someone who understands both sides of wealth, having it and not having it. Someone who's learned the hard way what matters more than money. The irony was almost too much to bear. 2 weeks ago, Kyle would have seen this job offer as his ticket back to the elite social circles he'd lost. Now, looking at his mother's smiling face on the wall, he understood it as something else entirely, a chance to honor her legacy, to become the kind of person his father had tried to raise. There's one more thing you should know, Matthew said, pulling out one final document. Your mother wasn't just a patient, she was our program director. She designed the whole family support system from her hospital bed. This, he handed Kyle a worn notebook, was her last project. The notebook was filled with Sarah's handwriting plans, ideas, sketches for expanding the program. On the last page, she'd written, remember, true wealth is measured by what you give when no one's watching. Kyle's vision blurred as he recognized the saying. His father had repeated it countless times throughout his childhood, always attributing it to someone wise all along. It had been his mother's words, her legacy living on through his father's quiet generosity. Matthew watched him process this revelation. The position is yours if you want it. But not because of your family name or your father's donations. Because in the past 2 weeks you've shown that you can learn from mistakes, that you understand the responsibility that comes with privilege. Through the window, Kyle could see the mall where everything had fallen apart and where, perhaps, everything had started to come together again. Mrs. Anderson would be on her bench now, sharing her lunch with strays. James would be starting his morning shift, pushing his janitor's cart with dignity. His father would be in his modest office, quietly changing lives without expecting recognition. Can I start in the diner's kitchen? Kyle asked finally. I think I need to understand service from the ground up like Mom did. Matthew's smile was all the answer he needed. As Kyle left the office that morning, his mother's photograph seemed to follow him with proud eyes. He had finally discovered what his father had known all along, that true wealth wasn't in the millions they had in the bank, but in the millions of ways they could help others without expecting anything in return. Dr. Stevens's office at Boston General Hospital hadn't changed in 5 years. The same motivational posters lined the walls, the same worn leather chair creaked under Kyle's weight as he sat down. He hadn't planned to come here, but after learning about his mother's work at the Whitman Foundation, he needed answers. I wondered when you'd find your way back here, Dr. Stevens said, removing his glasses. Your father visits every year on the anniversary. I always thought he might bring you someday. Kyle's fingers traced the arm of the chair, remembering how his mother's hand had rested in the same spot during her final consultation. I need to know the truth about her last days, about the experimental treatment that could have saved her." Dr. Stevens was quiet for a long moment, studying a file he'd pulled from his cabinet. "Your mother made me promise not to tell you this until you were ready to understand. I think perhaps that time has come." He opened the file, revealing a photograph of Sarah Thompson in her hospital bed, smiling despite the tubes and monitors surrounding her. She was writing in the same notebook Kyle had seen at the Whitman Foundation. The experimental treatment wasn't just expensive, Dr. Stevens began. It was a clinical trial with only 3 spots available. Your mother was qualified for all of them. Kyle leaned forward. "Then why didn't she?" Because Dr. Stevens interrupted gently. She gave up her spots. All 3 of them. To children from families who couldn't afford standard treatment, let alone experimental options. The revelation hit Kyle like a physical blow. She chose to die. She chose to give others a chance to live. Dr. Stevens pulled out 3 more photographs. Tommy Martinez, James's cousin, Lisa Chen, Alex's younger sister, and Emma Parker. Kyle's world tilted sideways. Emma? But her family was rich. They lost everything in the 2008 crash. Emma's treatment bankrupted them. That birthday party, you remember? It was funded by charitable donations. Your mother organized it from her hospital bed, knowing she wouldn't live to see it. Tears blurred Kyle's vision as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, the way Emma had tried to defend him at school recently, the knowing look in her eyes whenever they passed in the mall. Your father, Dr. Stevens continued, had finally raised enough for 1 treatment spot. He came running in here with a cashier's check, so proud, so hopeful. Your mother took his hand and told him she'd already given her spot away. Do you know what she said to him? Kyle shook his head, unable to speak. She said, "Richard, we can't save my life by letting a child die. That's not the example I want to set for our son." Dr. Stevens' voice cracked slightly. Your father fell to his knees right where you're sitting now, but your mother just smiled and asked him to promise something. What? Kyle whispered. That he would use whatever wealth he accumulated to help others, but always anonymously. That he would teach you the value of giving without recognition. That's why he lived so modestly. Even after making his millions, every extra dollar went to helping families like those your mother saved. Kyle's throat felt too tight for words. He thought of his recent behavior, the showing off, the cruelty, the desperate need for recognition. How far he had strayed from his mother's legacy. "There's more," Dr. Stevens said softly, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Your mother wrote this the day before she passed. Said to give it to you when you learned the truth about her choice." Kyle's hands trembled as he opened the envelope, his mother's familiar handwriting bringing fresh tears to his eyes. "My dearest Kyle, if you're reading this, you finally learned why I had to leave you so soon. Please don't be angry with your father for keeping this from you. I made him promise to wait until you were ready to understand that sometimes the richest choice is to give everything away. The hardest part wasn't choosing to give up my treatment spots. It was knowing I would miss watching you grow up. But I see so much potential in you, my sweet boy. The way you shared your lunch with classmates who had none, how you read stories to other patients' children, your quiet strength that reminds me so much of your father. Remember, this true wealth isn't in living a long life, but in filling whatever time we have with acts of kindness that outlive us. Your father will show you how to build financial wealth. He's brilliant at that. But I hope my choice shows you why we build it, not to elevate ourselves, but to lift others. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, more than all the sands on the beach, more than all the money in the world. Always with you, Mum." Kyle sat in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. Through the window he could see the hospital garden where the Whitman Foundation's photograph had been taken, where his mother had chosen to give away her chance at life so others might live. "She never regretted it," Dr. Stevens said quietly. Not even at the end. Her last words were about how much good your father would do with the money he was building. She saw it all coming, his success, his generosity, everything. She just didn't want any of it to come at the cost of someone else's child. As Kyle left the hospital that day, he carried more than his mother's letter. He carried the weight of her choice, the power of her example, and the understanding that true wealth wasn't what you kept for yourself, but what you gave away to others. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a message from Nelson Parker about some new scheme to flaunt their wealth. Kyle deleted it without reading, his mother's words echoing in his heart. True wealth isn't in living a long life, but in filling whatever time we have with acts of kindness that outlive us. The diner's evening rush had ended when Emma Parker walked in, still wearing her office clothes from her marketing job. Kyle was elbowed deep in dishwater, his uniform spotted with food stains. Their eyes met in the reflection of the chrome coffee machine. "We need to talk," Emma said, sliding onto a counter stool. "About your mother, about that birthday party, about everything." Kyle dried his hands slowly, remembering Dr. Stevens's revelation. The party that had humiliated him had been his mother's final gift, a desperate attempt to give Emma one last normal childhood memory before cancer took her life savings and her life. "Mrs. Chen," he called to his boss, "can I take my break?" They settled into a booth in the corner, the same one where Kyle and his father used to share their single slice of birthday cake. Emma's perfectly manicured fingers traced patterns on the worn Formica tabletop. "I didn't know until last week," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "about what your mother did for me, how she gave up her treatment spot so I could live." The silence between them was heavy with history shared and separate pain braided together across years of misunderstanding. "My family lost everything in the crash," Emma continued. "That party. It wasn't meant to be cruel. Your mother arranged it, all the venue, the decorations, everything. She wanted me to have one last normal day before." Her voice cracked. "Before everyone found out we were broke." Kyle remembered his mother's enthusiasm about him attending that party, how she'd helped iron his shirt from her hospital bed. But the video? The laughing. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I was angry. At being poor, at being sick, at needing charity. You were the only one who didn't know about my family situation, and I took it out on you. It was easier to be cruel than to admit I was just like you." Through the diner's window, Kyle could see James starting his evening shift at the mall. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. James's cousin Tommy, he was one of the other children my mother saved, wasn't he? Emma nodded. "That's why James never told you about the party's true nature. He was protecting both our secrets. His family's ongoing struggle, my family's fall from grace." The diner's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Kyle processed this information. All these years, he'd carried the wrong kind of shame, not shame for being poor, but shame for not understanding the complex web of kindness and sacrifice that had surrounded him. "I've been trying to apologize for years," Emma said softly. "But how do you apologize to someone whose mother died saving your life?" Kyle thought of his recent behavior, the arrogance, the cruelty, the desperate need to prove his worth through wealth. Maybe by not becoming the kind of person they died trying to prevent. Mrs. Chen appeared with 2 slices of chocolate cake, the same kind Kyle used to share with his father. "On the house," she said, her knowing smile suggesting she'd heard more than they realized. "Your mother used to bring me homework when I was in treatment," Emma said, picking up her fork. "She said education was the one thing nobody could take away from us. She tutored half the pediatric ward between her own treatments." Kyle remembered those hospital visits, his mother's pale face lit up by her determination to help others, his father's quiet support as she pushed herself beyond exhaustion to make a difference. "I want to make it right," Emma declared suddenly. "Not just with you, but with everyone. I'm quitting my job at my father's firm. The Whitman Foundation offered me a position running their education program for chronically ill children." Kyle felt a smile tugging at his lips. Funny you should mention that. I just accepted a position there myself. They shared a look of understanding, two people whose lives had been shaped by Sarah Thompson's final choice, now choosing to honor her legacy in their own ways. The diner's door chimed, and James walked in, still in his maintenance uniform. He hesitated when he saw them, but Kyle stood and gestured him over. "Join us," Kyle said, pulling out a chair. "I think it's time we all talked about my mother's real legacy." As James sat down, Mrs. Chen appeared with another slice of cake and 3 forks. For a moment, none of them spoke, just 3 young people sharing a simple dessert, united by the invisible threads of sacrifice and redemption that Sarah Thompson had woven between them. "To your mom," Emma finally said, raising her fork in a tiny salute, "who taught us that true wealth isn't about having everything, but about giving everything." To Mum, Kyle echoed, understanding for the first time that his mother's greatest gift hadn't been the money his father accumulated, but the example she set in giving it all away. Through the diner's window, they could see Mrs. Anderson on her usual bench sharing her dinner with stray dogs. The sight made Kyle smile, remembering her words about discovering what really matters. His mother had known all along that wealth wasn't something you counted in dollars, but in the lives you touched and the kindness you left behind. As the evening stretched on, 3 former adversaries became co-conspirators in a new mission to honor Sarah Thompson's legacy, not through displays of wealth, but through quiet acts of generosity that would ripple outward, touching lives she would never know but had somehow saved anyway. The call came during Kyle's evening shift at the diner. Mrs. Chen's face appeared in the kitchen doorway, unusually grave. "Kyle, Boston General Hospital is on the phone. It's about your father." The world narrowed to a tunnel of fluorescent lights and the pounding of his heart as Kyle ran through the hospital corridors. The same halls where his mother had spent her final days now echoed with his desperate footsteps. Dr. Stevens met him at the cardiac unit entrance. He collapsed at work, the doctor explained, leading Kyle to a private room. Severe exhaustion combined with stress-induced cardiac symptoms. We found him at his desk, reviewing donation files for the Whitman Foundation. Richard Thompson looked small in the hospital bed, his usual strength diminished by tubes and monitoring equipment. The sight hit Kyle like a physical blow. This was how his mother had looked near the end, though for very different reasons. "Dad," Kyle's voice cracked as he approached the bed. His father's eyes fluttered open, trying to focus. "The Martinez family's treatment payment. Need to make sure it went through," Richard mumbled, attempting to sit up. "Lie still," Dr. Stevens ordered gently. "The foundation can wait." But Kyle understood now his father never let helping others wait. Even now, even here, his first thought was for others' welfare. The weight of his own recent selfishness pressed down on Kyle's shoulders like a physical burden. "When was the last time you took a vacation?" Dr. Stevens asked Richard, checking his vitals, "or even a full night's sleep?" Richard's weak laugh turned into a cough. "There's always one more family to help, one more treatment to fund." Kyle remembered all the times he'd seen his father working late into the night, even after their wealth was secured. What he'd once mistaken for obsession with money had been obsession with using it to help others. "You've been carrying Mum's legacy alone for too long," Kyle said, taking his father's hand. The skin felt paper thin, like all the strength had been drained out by years of secret generosity. "Your mother," Richard's eyes filled with tears. "She would have been so disappointed in how I handled things. Should have told you the truth sooner." "No, Dad," Kyle's voice broke. "She would have been proud. So proud of everything you've done. Every life you've changed. I'm the one who lost sight of what matters." The heart monitor beeped steadily as father and son sat in silence, both remembering the woman who had taught them the true meaning of wealth. Outside the window, the Boston skyline glittered with lights, each one representing a family, a story, a potential need that Richard Thompson had dedicated his life to meeting. Promise me something, Richard said finally, his grip tightening slightly on Kyle's hand. Promise me you'll remember what your mother taught us, that true wealth isn't in what we keep, but in what we give away. Kyle finished the lesson finally, truly understood. I promise, Dad. But you have to promise something too. Promise you'll let me help carry this legacy. You don't have to do it alone anymore. Dr. Stevens checked the monitors one last time. With rest and reduced stress, he should make a full recovery. But this is a warning, Richard. You need to take care of yourself to keep taking care of others. As Kyle settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair for the night, he thought about all the nights his father must have spent in a similar chair, watching over his mother, planning how to help other families avoid the same pain. The magnitude of his father's quiet heroism, maintained for years without recognition or praise, humbled him completely. In his pocket, Kyle's phone buzzed with messages from his old wealthy friends, still trying to draw him back into their world of shallow displays and empty wealth. He turned the phone off without reading them. Here, in this hospital room, watching his father's chest rise and fall, he was learning the final lesson about true riches. Sometimes they cost everything you have, but they're worth infinitely more than what you give up. The weeks following Richard's hospitalization revealed the true extent of Kyle's isolation. The diner's regular customers avoided his section, memories of his previous arrogance still fresh in their minds. Even Mrs. Chen's warmth seemed tempered by caution, as if waiting to see if his recent humility was genuine or just another performance. At school, the silence was deafening. The elite crowd that had once embraced him now treated him like he was invisible, their designer-clad shoulders turning whenever he approached. Nelson Parker had made sure everyone knew about Kyle's fall from grace, spreading stories that mixed truth with cruel embellishments. Guess washing dishes is the only thing you were ever really qualified for, Nelson sneered one afternoon, deliberately dropping his lunch tray to create more work. His former friends laughed, the sound echoing across the cafeteria like glass breaking. Emma tried to maintain their newfound connection, but her family's pressure made it difficult. Dad says I can't risk our reputation by associating with. Well, you know, she explained awkwardly, avoiding his eyes in the hallway. The irony of her family's wealth being built on his mother's sacrifice hung unspoken between them. The tutoring program kids, once eager for his help, now watched him warily from behind their textbooks. One brave sixth grader finally voiced what they were all thinking: how do we know you won't just leave us again when something better comes along? James maintained a professional distance at the mall, their interactions limited to careful nods and avoided gazes. The weight of their shared history, from childhood friendship to cruel betrayal to uncertain present, made even simple greetings feel like navigating a minefield. The worst part was the whispers that followed him everywhere. Did you hear? His dad had a heart attack from the shame. I heard they're not really rich at all. It was all fake. Someone said his mom chose to die rather than see what he'd become. Each rumor carried a grain of truth twisted into poison, each former relationship a reminder of bridges he'd burned with his own hands. The designer clothes hanging unworn in his closet seemed to mock him, expensive armor that had failed to protect what really mattered. At home, the silence was different but no less painful. His father's empty chair at dinner reminded Kyle of all the relationships his dad had maintained through quiet generosity, while he had destroyed his through loud displays of wealth. The contrast was a lesson in itself. One evening, as Kyle walked home from his diner shift, he passed Mrs. Anderson's usual bench. She was there, as always, but turned away when he tried to catch her eye. Even the stray dogs she fed seemed to sense his isolation, keeping their distance where once they had eagerly accepted his offerings. The Whitman Foundation position waited, but Matthew had been clear: you need to rebuild trust in your community first. Real wealth is in relationships, not resumes. But in his darkest moments, usually late at night while sorting through his mother's old photographs, Kyle wondered if some bridges could never be rebuilt. If some kinds of trust, once broken, stayed that way despite all efforts to repair them. His phone remained silent, the stream of social media notifications replaced by an emptiness that echoed his internal state. The few times he checked his old accounts, he found himself blocked or unfollowed by nearly everyone who had once eagerly sought his attention. Yet somehow this isolation felt different from his childhood poverty. Back then, he had been poor but rich in genuine connections, his father's unwavering support, his mother's loving memory, friendships based on character rather than credit limits. Now, surrounded by material comfort but stripped of meaningful relationships, he understood true poverty for the first time. Each morning, as he put on his diner uniform or walked through school hallways alone, Kyle carried this understanding like a weight. He had traded real wealth, trust, respect, genuine connections for its hollow imitation. The journey back would be long, if it was possible at all. Rock bottom came on a rainy Tuesday evening, exactly 1 month after his father's hospitalization. Kyle sat alone in his bedroom, surrounded by the trappings of his brief reign as a pseudo-prince of Boston society. Designer clothes with tags still attached hung in his closet like expensive ghosts. The Porsche sat untouched in the garage, its keys gathering dust on his desk. Through his window, he could see into the Martinez family's kitchen across the street. James and his mother were having dinner, a simple meal shared with obvious love. The scene struck him with an almost physical pain, reminding him of similar dinners with his parents before wealth had corrupted his perspective. His phone lay silent on his bed, its screen dark. The last message he'd received was 3 days ago, a group text from Nelson Parker sharing a meme about poverty cosplay, clearly aimed at Kyle's current situation. The casual cruelty of it, once something he would have participated in, now made him feel hollow. Kyle picked up his mother's photograph, the one he'd banished to a drawer during his wealthy phase. Her smile seemed different now, knowing the truth about her sacrifice. How had he strayed so far from the path she'd laid out? How had he twisted his father's hard-won success into something so ugly? The sound of his father's coughing from downstairs twisted the knife of guilt deeper. Richard was recovering, but slowly, his body rebelling against years of putting others first. The doctors had ordered rest, but Kyle often found him at the kitchen table late at night, writing checks to families in need. Standing before his mirror, Kyle barely recognized himself. The designer clothes felt like a costume now, the expensive watch on his wrist like a shackle. His reflection showed someone who had everything and nothing at the same time, rich in possessions but bankrupt in spirit. In a sudden burst of energy, he began pulling clothes from his closet. Each item represented a moment of cruelty, a friendship betrayed, a value abandoned. The pile grew on his bed, thousands of dollars worth of material wealth that had cost him something far more precious. His hand stopped on a worn baseball mitt pushed to the back of the closet, the same one he'd used during Sunday games with his father before wealth had made him too important for such simple pleasures. The leather was cracked, the laces frayed, but it carried the weight of genuine memories of real connection. Sitting on his bed, surrounded by the evidence of his moral bankruptcy, Kyle felt the full weight of his isolation crush down on him. He had everything his childhood self had dreamed of having, and none of what had made that childhood self worthy of such dreams. The rain outside intensified, drumming against his window like accusations. Across the street, the lights in the Martinez's kitchen went dark. Kyle sat in the growing darkness of his room, holding his mother's photograph in one hand and his father's old baseball mitt in the other, symbols of the real wealth he'd traded for its counterfeit version. Tomorrow, he would have to face another day of whispers at school, of avoided gazes at the diner, of trying to rebuild bridges he'd burned. But tonight, in the quiet of his room, Kyle Thompson finally understood what true rock bottom felt like. It wasn't losing money or status. It was realizing that in chasing those things, he'd lost pieces of himself he wasn't sure he could ever get back. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of his pretense, leaving him with nothing but the truth of who he'd become and the daunting question of who he might still become. The discovery came while cleaning out the garage, a task Kyle had taken on to give his recovering father one less thing to worry about. Behind a stack of old medical bills and insurance denials, he found a weathered shoebox, its corners soft with age. Inside, wrapped in his mother's favorite yellow ribbon, was a stack of letters, each dated, each addressed to him. "My dearest Kyle," the first one began, dated just days before her death. "If you're reading this, you've probably just discovered something about our family's wealth or lack of it that has changed how you see everything. Let me tell you a story about money and what it really means." Kyle sank to the garage floor, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light as he unfolded the delicate pages. His mother's handwriting, once so familiar, now seemed like messages from another world. "When I first got sick," she wrote, "your father worked himself to exhaustion trying to save money for my treatment, but every night, no matter how tired he was, he would put $1 in our helping jar money set aside for others who had even less than we did. I watched that jar fill up penny by penny, even as our own savings drained away." Tears blurred Kyle's vision as he remembered that jar, a simple mason container that sat on their kitchen counter. He'd always assumed it was for emergencies. Now he understood it had been for other people's emergencies. "The day we learned my treatment wouldn't work." The letter continued, "Your father wanted to empty that jar for one last attempt at an experimental cure, but I had already given the money to the family of a little girl who needed heart surgery. Your father didn't understand at first, he was so desperate to save me. But then I asked him, what good is saving my life if we lose our souls in the process?" Each page revealed more of his mother's philosophy about wealth and worth. She wrote about watching Kyle share his lunch with classmates who had none, about how proud she was when he volunteered at the hospital, about her dreams for the kind of man he would become. "Money is like water, my darling boy. Hold it too tightly and it slips through your fingers. Pour it out to nourish others, and it creates gardens where only desert existed before. Your father understands this now, that's why he works so hard, not just to make money, but to use it wisely." The final letter, dated the day before she died, struck Kyle like a physical blow. "I've made a choice that your father will probably struggle to explain when you're older. I've given up my chance at an experimental treatment so other children can live. Some might call this foolish. But I believe it's the richest decision I've ever made. Because true wealth isn't in living a long life, but in filling whatever life we have with meaning." At the bottom of the box, Kyle found something else, a small notebook filled with names, dates, and amounts. It was his mother's record of every act of kindness she'd witnessed or participated in. The last entry, in his father's handwriting, simply read Sarah's legacy fund, helping one family at a time. Kyle sat surrounded by these paper treasures, understanding flowing through him like a cleansing wave. His mother hadn't just left him a philosophy about wealth, she'd left him a roadmap for living a rich life that had nothing to do with bank balances. The sound of his father's car pulling into the driveway roused Kyle from his revelations. He gathered the letters carefully, reverently, but left one out, the final letter his mother had written. As Richard entered the garage, Kyle held it out wordlessly. Father and son sat together on the dusty garage floor, reading Sarah's words in the fading afternoon light. When they finished, Richard pulled out his wallet and extracted a worn piece of paper, the original helping jar list from all those years ago. "She never stopped teaching us, did she?" Richard said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Kyle looked at the legacy his mother had left, not in money or property, but in lessons about what truly made a life rich. The designer clothes in his closet suddenly seemed not just wasteful, but insulting to her memory. "Dad," he said finally, "I think it's time to start our own helping jar." The smile that spread across Richard's face was worth more than all the wealth they'd accumulated in the past 25 years. In that moment, surrounded by his mother's letters and his father's love, Kyle finally understood what real riches looked like. The evening after discovering Sarah's letters, Kyle and Richard sat in their kitchen, sharing a single slice of chocolate cake, just like old times. The familiar ritual felt different now, weighted with unspoken truths waiting to be revealed. "I need to tell you everything," Richard began, his fingers tracing the pattern on Sarah's old teacup, "about how we built our wealth and why I kept it hidden for so long." The story unfolded like a carefully preserved photograph, details emerging in sharp focus. After Sarah's death, Richard had thrown himself into learning everything about finance and investment. Every lunch break was spent studying market trends, every evening devoted to analyzing investment opportunities. "I started with $217, Richard explained. "The money left in your mother's helping jar after she gave away the rest. I promised her I would multiply it, not for us, but for others who needed help." His first investment was in a small tech company that manufactured medical equipment. "I chose it because they were developing affordable versions of the machines that could have helped your mother. When their stock tripled, I knew she was guiding my hands." Richard's voice grew softer as he described the years of careful planning, the strategic investments that slowly built their fortune. He worked 3 jobs, living on minimal sleep, wearing the same clothes until they fell apart. Every extra dollar went into his growing investment portfolio. "But here's what I never told you," he continued, pulling out an old ledger. "Every time our investments made money, the first portion always went to helping others. Your mother's rule, give first, save second." The ledger told a story of its own. Hundreds of entries, each representing a life touched by their hidden wealth, medical bills paid anonymously, scholarships funded quietly, small businesses saved from bankruptcy. Richard had created a network of silent generosity that spanned Boston. "Remember Tommy Martinez's cancer treatment? The anonymous donor was us. Emma Parker's experimental therapy? That came from your mother's life insurance policy, her last gift to another child. Every time you felt ashamed of our apparent poverty, we were actually helping someone else's child survive." Kyle's hands trembled as he turned the ledger's pages. Names he recognized jumped out at him: classmates, neighbors, even some of the same people he'd later mocked for being poor. His father had been helping them all along, hiding their wealth not from shame, but from a deep understanding of responsibility. "The hardest part," Richard admitted, his voice cracking, "was watching you struggle with feeling poor when we had millions. But your mother made me promise to wait until you understood that wealth wasn't about what you could buy, but what you could give away." He pulled out another document, the original business plan for his investment strategy. On the cover, in Sarah's handwriting, was a simple message: "Build wealth like water. Let it flow to where it's needed most." "The day you discovered our bank balance," Richard continued, "I broke my promise to your mother. I should have prepared you better, taught you more about why we lived the way we did. Instead, I watched you repeat the same mistakes I made when I first started making money." Kyle remembered his father's face at the bank that day, not proud of their wealth, but worried about what it might do to his son's character. "You see, before I met your mother, I was obsessed with becoming rich. She taught me that being wealthy and being rich were different things. Rich is a bank balance. Wealth is what you do with it." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "When I had my heart attack, it wasn't from overwork. It was from knowing I'd failed both you and your mother by not teaching you the difference sooner." The truth hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Kyle thought about his recent behavior, the showing off, the cruelty, the desperate need to prove his worth through displays of wealth. He had completely missed the true legacy his parents had built. "The money in our accounts," Richard said finally, turning back to face his son, "isn't really ours. We're just its caretakers, meant to direct it where it can do the most good. That's what your mother understood, what I learned from her, and what I should have taught you from the beginning." He pulled out one final document, a trust agreement naming Kyle as co-trustee of the Thompson Family Foundation. "You're ready now, if you want it. Not because you're my son, but because you've learned what took me years to understand, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in lives changed." Kyle looked at the trust agreement, seeing it not as a gateway to riches, but as a responsibility to continue his mother's legacy of quiet generosity. The numbers on the page weren't just amounts, they were opportunities to help others, to honor Sarah's final choice. "I understand now," Dad Kyle said softly. "Why we lived like we did. Why Mom made the choices she made. Why you kept the truth hidden until I was ready." Richard smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Your mother would be proud of you now," he said, "not because you've learned about our money, but because you've learned what it's really for." The revelations about the Thompson family's secret generosity triggered an avalanche of truths throughout the community. It began with Emma Parker, standing up during lunch period, her voice carrying across the cafeteria as she shared her own story. "When I was 10, she announced, an anonymous donor paid for my cancer treatment. Today I learned it was Kyle's mother who gave up her own chance at life to save mine." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of Nelson Parker dropping his phone in shock. Like dominoes falling, other stories emerged. James Martinez stood next, his usual quiet dignity amplified by purpose. "The Thompson Foundation didn't just help my cousin Tommy. They've been paying for my mother's treatments anonymously for years. While some of us were mocking Kyle for being poor, his family was saving lives." One by one, students and teachers came forward with their own connections to the Thompson family's hidden philanthropy. The school librarian revealed how Richard Thompson had secretly funded the tutoring program for years. The cafeteria worker spoke about the anonymous donations that kept the free lunch program running during budget cuts. Mrs. Chen closed the diner early one evening to share her story with Kyle. "Your mother was my first customer when I opened this place," she said, tears in her eyes. "When the bank threatened to foreclose 3 years ago, an anonymous investor bought my loan. I never knew it was your father until today." The web of quiet generosity stretched further than anyone had imagined. Dr. Stevens called a community meeting at the hospital, where he revealed the full scope of the Thompson Family Foundation's impact. Hundreds of families helped, countless lives saved or improved, all without recognition or praise. Even Nelson Parker's family held a secret connection. His younger sister's life-saving surgery had been partially funded by the foundation when their insurance denied coverage. The revelation left him standing speechless in the school hallway, his carefully constructed world of social hierarchy crumbling around him. Mrs. Anderson, still feeding strays on her mall bench, added her own piece to the puzzle. "Richard Thompson was the only person who offered me a job after my firm collapsed," she shared. "He saw value in me when everyone else saw scandal. That's true wealth, seeing the worth in people when they can't see it themselves." The stories created a new understanding of wealth in the community. Students who had once flaunted designer labels now volunteered at the hospital. Those who had mocked others for being poor began to question their own definitions of value. But the most profound revelation came from Emma's father, William Parker, during a community gathering at the Whitman Foundation. 25 years ago, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion, "Richard Thompson took a chance on investing in my struggling real estate company. He didn't just save my business, he taught me how to use success to help others. Everything the Parker family has now we owe to the Thompsons' example." The interconnected web of kindness and generosity revealed something profound about community itself, that true wealth wasn't held in individual bank accounts, but in the invisible bonds between people who helped each other survive and thrive. Kyle sat in the back of these gatherings, listening to story after story, understanding finally flowing through him like a cleansing river. His family's millions hadn't been built just through smart investments, but through a profound understanding of human value that transcended monetary worth. As the last story was shared, Dr. Stevens stood to read from Sarah Thompson's hospital diary. "Wealth isn't a number in a bank. It's the network of kindness we build when we help others rise. Money is just the tool, compassion is the true currency." The community secrets, once revealed, transformed into something powerful, a template for how wealth could be used to strengthen the bonds between people rather than divide them. The Thompson family's legacy wasn't in their bank balance but in the countless lives they had touched, the hopes they had restored, the futures they had made possible. Kyle understood now that his father hadn't hidden their wealth out of shame or fear, but out of a deep understanding that money's true power lay not in what it could buy, but in what it could build: trust, hope, community, and the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. As the stories continued to unfold, each one revealing another thread in the tapestry of connection his parents had woven, Kyle realized that he wasn't just heir to a fortune, he was heir to a philosophy that could change the world, one quiet act of kindness at a time. The transformation of the Thompson legacy began on a quiet Monday morning, with Kyle standing before the Whitman Foundation board. Gone were his designer clothes, replaced by a simple suit that his father had worn during his early investment days. In his hands he held his mother's weathered notebook and his own carefully prepared proposal. "The Sarah Thompson Memorial Fund," he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness, "will focus on 3 things my mother believed in: education, healthcare, and second chances." The board members, including Matthew Whitman and Emma Parker, leaned forward as Kyle outlined his vision. The plan was ambitious yet grounded in his family's philosophy. Every dollar from Kyle's trust fund would be matched by hands-on community service. He would continue working at the diner, donating his earnings to the foundation. The portion would be sold, its proceeds funding scholarships for students from low-income families. His first act of redemption came later that day, when he walked into James's mother's hospital room. "The foundation will cover all your remaining treatments," he said simply, but this time not anonymously. It's time people knew where help came from, so they could pass it on themselves. The tutoring program was revived and expanded, with Kyle taking on the most challenging cases personally. He worked with students who had given up on education, sharing his mother's belief that knowledge was the one form of wealth that couldn't be taken away. At the mall, he approached each person he had once mocked with sincere apologies and concrete offers of help. The janitor whose uniform he had ridiculed received a scholarship for his daughter. The cashier he had belittled was offered funding for her small business dream. Each act of redemption came with his mother's story, spreading her philosophy of genuine wealth. Mrs. Anderson's bench became a regular stop in his daily routine. Together, they created a program matching elderly mentors with struggling youth, combining wisdom with opportunity. The stray dog she fed now had a proper shelter, funded by the sale of Kyle's designer wardrobe. The diner became more than just his workplace. It transformed into a community hub where anyone could find a hot meal and a helping hand. Kyle instituted a pay-it-forward system, allowing customers to pre-purchase meals for those who couldn't afford them. Each Saturday, he shared a single slice of cake with someone who needed not just food, but dignity. His father, watching from the sidelines, saw Sarah's legacy growing in ways she could never have imagined. Kyle hadn't just learned about managing wealth, he had embraced the deeper responsibility of using it to create positive change. The most powerful moment came when Kyle stood before his old private school assembly, not as a wealthy student showing off, but as a humble speaker sharing truth. Real wealth, he told his peers, isn't about having everything. It's about sharing whatever you have, whether that's money, time, or simply kindness. Nelson Parker, sitting in the back row, was the first to stand and applaud. The former bully approached Kyle afterward, tears in his eyes, asking how he could help. Together, they established a mentoring program pairing privileged students with those needing support, breaking down the barriers that money often created. Each morning, before starting his day of service, Kyle would look at his mother's photograph and his father's proud smile, understanding finally that they had given him something far more valuable than millions in the bank. They had taught him how to make those millions matter. The designer clothes gathered dust in his closet, replaced by simple, practical attire that spoke of service rather than status. His hands, once manicured and soft, grew calloused from real work, each mark a badge of honor in his journey from entitled heir to genuine philanthropist. In his mother's old notebook, Kyle began adding his own entries, documenting not the amounts given, but the lives changed, the hopes restored, the dignity returned. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of real wealth his parents had begun weaving long ago, a legacy not of money, but of meaningful impact in the lives of others. Recovery came to the Thompson household like spring after a long winter, gradual yet transformative. Richard's health improved steadily, strengthened not just by rest and medication, but by watching his son embrace the true meaning of their family's wealth. The first tangible sign of healing came when Kyle moved his father's old armchair back into the living room, replacing the expensive modern furniture he'd once insisted upon. Sarah's yellow curtains returned to their windows, their faded fabric casting warm light across family photographs that now proudly displayed their journey from poverty to purpose. Sunday mornings took on a new ritual. Father and son would start at the diner, sharing their traditional single slice of cake, but now they invited others to join them. James and his mother, fresh from her treatments, Emma, learning to reconnect with her own family's humble beginnings, even Nelson, slowly learning the value of genuine connection over social status. But the baseball mitt emerged from storage, and Catch in the Park became a weekly tradition again. But now they invited children from the hospital's pediatric ward to join them, transforming a simple game into therapy for young patients. Richard's eyes would mist over watching Kyle teach a child in a wheelchair how to hold a ball, seeing Sarah's gentle spirit living on in their son. Their home, once showcasing wealth through expensive decorations, became a gathering place for the community. The dining room that had briefly housed a designer table now hosted weekly meetings for families navigating medical crises. Kyle and Richard shared their experience, their resources, and most importantly, their understanding that no one should face such challenges alone. The teacup collection returned to its place of honor in the kitchen cabinet, each chip and crack telling a story of survival and perseverance. Richard would often find Kyle showing them to visitors, explaining how his mother had found beauty in imperfection and wealth in helping others. One particularly meaningful evening, the Thompsons hosted a dinner for all the families they had helped over the years. The house overflowed with people whose lives had been touched by Sarah's legacy and Richard's quiet generosity. As Kyle moved among the guests, serving food he'd helped prepare at the diner, Richard saw his late wife's grace in every gesture, every kind word, every genuine smile. The Porsche was sold, replaced by the old Toyota they'd kept in the garage. Kyle drove it proudly now, understanding that true dignity came not from what you drove, but where you were headed and why. The car became a symbol of their renewed purpose, often filled with supplies for families in need or children headed to medical appointments. Perhaps the most profound healing came in the quiet moments. Father and son would sit in the evening light, drinking tea from Sarah's cups, discussing not stock portfolios or investment strategies, but the lives they touched that day. Richard's face had lost its worried lines, replaced by the peaceful expression of a man who knew his family's legacy was secure. The wall of their living room now held a new addition, a large cork board covered with thank you notes, children's drawings, and photographs of lives changed. Each item represented not a dollar amount given, but a connection made, a life improved, a hope restored. It was Sarah's kind of wealth, measured in smiles and second chances rather than bank balances. The newspapers that had once run stories about Kyle's excessive spending now published articles about the Thompson Family Foundation's community impact. But neither Kyle nor Richard paid much attention to the publicity. They were too busy living their truth that family wealth was not about accumulation but distribution, not about showing off but showing up for others. As Richard watched his son grow into this understanding, he felt Sarah's presence more strongly than ever. She would have been proud of how their family had healed, not just from his recent health scare or Kyle's crisis of character, but from the deeper wound of forgetting what truly mattered. The healing wasn't just physical or emotional, it was spiritual, a restoration of purpose that made their house feel like home again, and their wealth feel like what it had always been meant to be, a tool for helping others heal too. 5 years after the revelation that changed everything, Kyle Thompson stood at the podium of the newly dedicated Sarah Thompson Memorial Wing at Boston General Hospital. The audience before him included faces from every chapter of his journey. James in a doctor's coat, having finished medical school on a Thompson Foundation scholarship. Emma running the foundation's education programs. Mrs. Anderson, still dispensing wisdom from her mall bench, but now as the head of their mentorship initiative. My mother once wrote that wealth is like water. Kyle began, his father beaming proudly from the front row. Hold it too tightly and it slips through your fingers. Pour it out to nourish others, and it creates gardens where only desert existed before. The wing would serve families facing catastrophic illnesses, providing not just medical care but the comprehensive support. Sarah had envisioned educational programs for children during treatment, job training for parents, and a community of hope for those facing their darkest hours. Richard Thompson had made his final investment the previous year, turning over his entire fortune to the foundation. The family now lived comfortably but modestly in their original house, the yellow curtains still catching the morning sun. Kyle continued working shifts at the diner, not from necessity but choice, using his tips to buy extra slices of cake for those who needed sweetness in their lives. True wealth. Wealth, Kyle continued at the podium, isn't measured in dollars or cents. It's measured in the lives we touch, the hope we restore, and the love we share. My family's journey taught me that being rich and being wealthy are two very different things. You can be rich with an overflowing bank account, but you can only be wealthy with an overflowing heart. The legacy of the Thompson family had spread beyond Boston. Other wealthy families, inspired by their example, began their own quiet revolutions of generosity. Nelson Parker, transformed by the experience, now ran his family's charitable foundation with the same principles he had once mocked. The diner had become a model for community transformation, its pay-it-forward system replicated across the country. Mrs. Chen's daughter was in medical school, her tuition covered by the tips Kyle had earned washing dishes. Every Sunday, the booth, where Kyle and his father had shared their single slice of cake, became a gathering place for those learning to rebuild their lives. My mother made a choice, Kyle concluded, his voice strong with conviction. She chose to give up her life so others could live. My father made a choice to build wealth not for himself but for others. And I made a choice to learn from their example, though I took the longer, harder road to understanding. The plaque beside the wing's entrance bore Sarah's words, "True wealth is not what we keep, but what we give away." Below it, smaller but no less significant, was the daily count of lives touched, hope restored, and communities strengthened, the only numbers that truly mattered to the Thompson legacy. As the ceremony ended, Kyle returned to his shift at the diner, exchanging his suit for an apron. His Yale Business School acceptance letter lay unopened at home. He would attend, but not to learn how to make money. He would study how to make money matter. In the kitchen, washing dishes beside a new employee learning the same lessons he had, Kyle caught his reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine. He saw his mother's smile, his father's determination, and his own hard-won wisdom in the image. The ghost of his former self, the arrogant young man obsessed with displaying wealth, had been replaced by someone who understood that true riches couldn't be worn, driven, or displayed. They could only be shared, multiplied through giving, and measured in the changes they created in others' lives. Outside, Boston's elite still drove their luxury cars and wore their designer labels. But within the community the Thompsons had built, a different kind of wealth flowed freely, measured not in dollars, but in dignity, not in possessions, but in purpose, not in what was kept, but in what was given away. And that, as Sarah Thompson had known all along, was the truest measure of a wealthy life. If this story of wealth, redemption, and true value has touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moments resonated with you the most? Share your own experiences with understanding true wealth. Support our team by subscribing to see more inspiring stories that challenge our perspectives and warm our hearts. Every like helps us reach more people with messages of hope and transformation. Share this video with friends and family who might need this reminder about what really matters in life. Together, let's build a community that values character over currency, kindness over capital, and genuine connections over grand displays.